Tonight, we begin with a development that federal transportation officials had feared, dismissed, and quietly prepared for behind closed doors. A change that unfolded not over months, not over years, but in a matter of weeks. Weeks that will determine whether you keep your driving privileges. Weeks that will affect tens of millions of Americans who have no idea this is happening. Weeks that could leave ordinary drivers, people who have never had a ticket, never missed a payment, never broken a rule, suddenly unable to legally get behind the wheel. What the federal government did today crossed a line that state DMVs had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the Department of Homeland Security did not hesitate. They responded with speed, authority, and an enforcement deadline that cannot be ignored. For over 20 years now, there had been warning signs, not official announcements, not formal press releases, just quiet signals that the federal government was preparing something that would fundamentally reshape how Americans prove who they are. The Real ID Act has been patient, yes, but it has been relentless in its patience. Its enforcement timeline has followed a certain rhythm, a slow march, almost a ritual of delay after delay. But what set off alarm bells in state capitals and DMV offices across the country this winter was that the postponements went silent. Transportation policy experts who monitor federal compliance deadlines know the indicators. The quiet disappearance of extension requests from state legislatures, the sudden increase in DHS compliance announcements, the updated TSA signage appearing in airports nationwide, the sudden shift in tone from government communications, from "you have time" to "the deadline is real." All of that went quiet. The delays stopped, the extensions dried up, and whenever the federal government stops extending a deadline, it means that deadline is about to become real. Early this year, federal authorities confirmed what many transportation insiders had been watching for: a hard enforcement posture, including compliance checkpoints and federal access restrictions that had not been activated in the 20 years since the Real ID Act was first passed. These are the kinds of enforcement mechanisms that the Department of Homeland Security only activates when they are signaling something very specific: that the grace period is over, that federal facilities and commercial flights will begin rejecting non-compliant IDs, that this time there will be no extension. Observers did not know which of those three scenarios would hit first, or whether all three would arrive at once. But what they did know was that the federal government was changing its enforcement strategy. And when a federal agency shifts enforcement posture without offering an escape valve, even by a small measure, every American with a standard driver's license pays attention. Or they should. Here is what you need to understand. This is not about driving. This is about identity. And right now, millions of Americans are holding an ID that the federal government is preparing to no longer recognize. The enforcement warning issued by the Department of Homeland Security tonight is not normal. It is not routine. It is not symbolic. It is urgent. Officials briefed after briefing described the March 2026 deadline as final, non-negotiable, and perhaps most importantly, legally binding, which means if your state-issued ID does not meet Real ID standards by May 7, 2025, already passed, or if you personally have not upgraded your license, you will be turned away from TSA security checkpoints and federal building entrances. But a warning only works if the public hears it. Most Americans have not heard it. In fact, surveys conducted in 2024 showed that nearly 60% of Americans were unaware of the Real ID enforcement status in their state. Here's what we know. Within weeks of the current federal posture shift, TSA agents at major airports began flagging travelers whose IDs did not carry the gold star or the DHS marking that signals Real ID compliance. These weren't optional checks. These were enforcement-level screenings, the kind that TSA only deploys when they are preparing to begin full rejection of non-compliant documents. Tonight, federal sources confirmed that enforcement action is now active across all 50 states, including several states whose DMVs had recently been flagged as still processing high backlogs of Real ID upgrade applications. States are processing applications before the federal deadlines can trigger mass rejection events. They are upgrading driver's license systems. They are expanding DMV appointment availability. They are pushing online verification tools that allow residents to check their compliance status without waiting in line. In other words, your state is trying to get you compliant before the federal government forces a crisis. The infrastructure is what would have made non-compliance a catastrophe. The inability to board a domestic flight, the inability to enter a federal courthouse, the inability to access military bases or Social Security offices. This is what made the DHS warning so urgent. The old standard driver's license wasn't just inadequate. It was operationally rejected at the federal level. It represented the kind of credential gap that could strand American citizens at airport security if left unaddressed. And state governments, understanding that fully, responded with action. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They did not ignore the deadline. They did not pass it off to the next administration. They upgraded the systems. They opened the appointments. They told their residents, "This is real and you need to act." And here's where the story becomes even more critical. Policy analysts now believe the federal government's latest push was designed to test the responsiveness of state-level infrastructure. After years of pandemic-era delays and DMV backlogs, Washington wanted to see whether states would scramble to comply or whether public apathy would force another postponement. But instead, the opposite is happening. States didn't ignore the mandate. They didn't lobby for extensions. They enacted upgrades that were so efficient, so visible, that even skeptical observers took notice. You don't get Washington's attention easily on compliance issues. But state-level action this year did. Transportation policy analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described the federal government's shift in posture as a credibility test, a way to see whether 20 years of delay had made the Real ID Act meaningless or whether it still had teeth. And state governments proved that they remain both responsive and capable. Their implementation efforts were not only efficient, they were targeted so precisely that millions of residents who previously had no idea about Real ID are now walking out of DMV offices with Gold Star licenses. That matters because it shows something important about the system. It shows that state governments are not passive observers in this process. They are active protectors of their residents' ability to move freely within this country. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of what is now underway. DMVs in high-population states like California, Texas, Florida, and New York have dramatically expanded appointment windows, with some offering weekend and evening hours for the first time since the pandemic. Federal authorities have updated all TSA checkpoint signage to prominently display which documents are now accepted and which are no longer valid for domestic flight boarding as of the enforcement date. Online Real ID status checkers, operated by the DHS and individual state DMV portals, are now processing hundreds of thousands of status inquiries per day, numbers that had been barely in the thousands just 18 months ago. This isn't just a paperwork update. This isn't just a government compliance formality. This is a fundamental reshaping of how American identity is verified at every federally controlled access point. This is a national security infrastructure upgrade that has been 20 years in the making. And national security infrastructure is the one thing the federal government has struggled to keep apolitical since the Real ID Act was first triggered by the 9/11 Commission's recommendations. For every delay they have granted, the federal government has countered with something that raises the stakes when compliance finally arrives. Remember, the public thought this deadline would be extended again. They thought the government would blink. They thought, as they had every other time, that the new deadline would become a suggestion rather than a hard stop. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. TSA checkpoints are preparing to reject non-compliant licenses. Federal buildings are updating their access protocols, and millions of Americans who haven't upgraded yet are running out of time faster than they realize. What makes this moment so urgent, and so consequential, is that the March 2026 enforcement phase is arriving at a time when American travelers are under an enormous amount of practical pressure. Commuters want to keep getting to work without additional government checkpoints. Families want to fly for spring break, summer vacations, and holiday trips without being turned away at security. Business travelers want to maintain access to federal contractors and government facilities without credential complications. Seniors and low-income Americans, the populations least likely to have upgraded, want to maintain full access to Social Security offices, VA hospitals, and other federal services they depend on. The government is balancing these demands while simultaneously enforcing a mandate that affects every single adult in the country. And when governments in that position enforce hard deadlines without further delay, they're not doing it from indifference. They're doing it because the security infrastructure requires it. They're doing it because the original 9/11 Commission recommendation that sparked this law has never gone away. The Department of Homeland Security's official statement, now distributed to every state DMV, every major airline, and every federal agency, was designed to signal that the federal government is not willing to allow another cycle of noncompliance to undermine national identity security. Officials said plainly that operating with a non-real ID compliant license is inconsistent with current federal access requirements. That is carefully calibrated legal language for, if your ID doesn't have the star, don't expect to board your flight. You don't usually hear that tone from the Department of Homeland Security unless something serious is at stake. And the enforcement of more than 20 years of post-9/11 identity law is, without question, serious. Meanwhile, across the country, state transportation officials are telling their residents the same thing in plain terms. They are saying, check your license today. If it does not have a gold star or a DHS-approved marking, you must upgrade before the next federal enforcement phase. They are saying, do not wait for a reminder from the airport. Do not wait until you are turned away at security. Go to your DMV or their online portal this week. And they are saying, bring your documents. Bring your proof of residency. Bring your Social Security card or proof of your Social Security number. And walk out with an ID that still works in this country. These are not warnings designed to create panic. These are statements from people who understand just how high the inconvenience stakes have become for ordinary Americans who simply do not know what they do not know. Here's what makes the situation even more far-reaching. The March 2026 enforcement update is not isolated. Along with the primary Real ID enforcement phase, enhanced driver's licenses, currently offered in only a handful of states, are also being promoted as a Real ID-compliant alternative that includes border crossing capabilities. Passport cards are being newly emphasized as a federal fallback option for Americans who struggle to meet their state's Real ID document requirements. Federal contractors and private security firms guarding federally licensed facilities have increased documentation checks targeting non-star IDs at building entrances across major metropolitan areas. All of this happened within the same 12-month enforcement window. When the federal government moves multiple compliance mechanisms at once, it means something larger is underway. It means the era of the old driver's license as a universal, unchallenged form of federal identification is over. Policy analysts are now considering several possibilities for what March 2026 actually looks like on the ground. One possibility is that the federal government is preparing for a soft rollout, flagging non-compliant IDs without immediately rejecting them in a final grace period gesture. Another possibility is that the federal government is attempting to use airport rejections as a high-visibility shock event that drives mass DMV upgrades in the weeks immediately following. A third possibility, the one worrying transportation officials the most, is that the federal government is attempting to begin a permanent two-tier ID system, where Real ID holders move through federal access points freely, while non-compliant ID holders face escalating restrictions that eventually extend beyond airports. But today, the window to act is still open. They didn't close the DMV appointments. They didn't eliminate online upgrade options. They didn't remove the ability to renew early. You still have time. But the clock is moving. What we're watching now is a test of national readiness. The federal government wants to see whether Americans will comply voluntarily or wait for a disruption to force the issue. State governments want to show that their DMV infrastructure is capable of handling mass upgrade requests without collapsing under volume. Transportation authorities want to prevent a summer travel season defined by airport checkpoint chaos. And ordinary Americans, you, watching this, Want to prevent the moment at the gate when a TSA agent looks at your ID, looks at you, and says the words no traveler ever wants to hear. I'm sorry, this isn't valid. Tonight, we've heard from transportation policy monitors who are now tracking real-time DMV appointment availability across all 50 states. They say appointment windows in major cities are filling faster than at any point since the Real ID Act was first enforced. They say online document pre-verification tools, which allow residents to confirm their documents qualify before visiting a DMV, are now processing record daily volumes. And they say the federal government's decision to maintain the March 2026 deadline without further extension is likely part of a broader credibility strategy intended to permanently close the era of Real ID postponements. But the public is not panicking. In fact, the public, when informed, is acting. Their response today, practical, proactive, and decisive, sent a message to Washington that ordinary Americans, when given the facts, will do what is necessary. And it sent a message to state governments that their DMV infrastructure, when adequately resourced and publicly promoted, is capable of handling exactly this kind of national compliance event. As the weeks between now and March 2026 go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the federal government hopes to achieve in each phase of enforcement. But what we do know is that the window to act is still open. It protects your ability to fly domestically without additional complications. It protects your access to federal buildings, facilities, and services you may depend on. And it protects you from the specific kind of travel disruption that happens when your ID gets flagged at the wrong moment in the wrong line. What happens next will depend on what you do in the next few weeks. If you upgrade now, this moment will be remembered as nothing more than a routine government compliance event you handled early and easily. If you wait, the federal government has already shown they are prepared to enforce, and prepared to do so in ways that will be impossible to ignore at an airport security checkpoint. And tonight, for the first time in over 2 decades, the federal government's patience with voluntary compliance appears to be genuinely exhausted. Washington is quiet, too quiet. And when Washington goes quiet on a deadline, it means they are done extending it. It means they are preparing to enforce it. Because tonight, the federal government reminded every American something they have been warned about many times before. Your old license is not forever. Federal access is not guaranteed without compliance. And the time to act is always before the deadline, never after. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. The March 2026 enforcement phase is real. The consequences for non-compliance are real, and the window to protect yourself by upgrading your license today is open right now, but it will not stay open forever. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this national compliance story unfolds.